Psychoanalysis as a system of personality. Freud's system did not deal with all those topics that were typically included in the psychology textbooks of his time, but he did explore areas other psychologists tended to ignore, such as unconscious motivating forces, conflicts among those forces, and the effects of conflicts on behavior. He was trying to develop an approach to a complete understanding of the human personality, a topic relatively ignored by the earlier schools of thought that we have discussed thus far. Freud believed that instincts are the propelling or motivating forces of personality, the biological forces that release mental energy. Although the word instinct has become accepted usage in the English language, it does not convey Freud's actual intention. He did not use the German equivalent instinct when referring to the human personality, only when describing innate drives in animals. Freud's term for human motivating forces was Trieb, best translated as impulse or driving force. So therefore, instinct in Freud's definition is impulse or driving force. Instincts, according to Freud, are mental representations of internal stimuli, such as hunger, that motivate personality and behavior. Freudian instincts are not inherited predispositions, the usual meaning of instinct. They are not inherited predispositions, but refer rather to sources of stimulation within the body. The goal of instincts is to remove or reduce that stimulation through some behavior, such as eating, drinking, or sexual activity. Freud did not attempt to offer a detailed list of every possible human instinct, but he grouped them into two general categories: the life instincts and the death instinct. Life instincts include hunger, thirst, and sex. They are concerned with self-preservation and the survival of the species, and thus are the creative forces that sustain life. And therefore, life instincts are the drive for ensuring survival of the individual and the species by satisfying the needs for food, water, oxygen, and sex. The form of energy through which life instincts are manifested is called libido. And libido is to Freud the psychic energy that drives a person toward pleasurable thoughts and behaviors. It is not the libido that is commonly thought of in relation to sex drive. To Freud, the libido is the psychic energy that drives a person toward pleasurable thoughts and behaviors. The death instinct, however, is a destructive force that can be directed inward as a masochism or suicide, or outward as in hatred and aggression. As Freud grew older, he became convinced that aggression could be a powerful motivator for human behavior, such as sex. Again, the death instincts is the unconscious drive toward decay, destruction, and aggression. Freud was aware of an aggressive tendency within himself. Colleagues describe him as a good hater, and some of his writings indicate a high level of aggressiveness. That tendency also can be seen in the bitterness and finality of his breaks with dissenters within the psychoanalytic movement. The concept of aggression as a motivator has been far better received by psychoanalysts than the suggestion of a death instinct. One analyst wrote that the death instinct should be relegated to the dustbin of history. Another suggested that if Freud was a genius, then the death instinct was an instance of genius having a bad day. In his early work, Freud suggested that mental life consisted of two parts, the conscious and the unconscious, concerning levels of personality. The conscious portion, like the visible part of an iceberg, is small and insignificant. It presents only the surface, that is, only a superficial glimpse of the total personality. The vast and powerful unconscious, like the portion of the iceberg that exists beneath the water's surface, contains the instincts, those driving forces for all human behavior. In later writings, Freud revised the simple conscious-unconscious distinction and proposed instead an idea called the id, ego, and superego. The id. The id corresponds roughly to Freud's earlier notion of unconscious. It is the most primitive and least accessible part of the personality and includes the sex and aggressive instincts. Freud wrote, quote, "We call it a cauldron full of seething excitations. The id knows no judgments of value, no good and evil, no morality. The id seeks immediate satisfaction without regard for the circumstances of reality. The id operates according to what Freud called the pleasure principle, concerned with reducing tension by seeking pleasure and avoiding pain." Again, the id is the source of psychic energy and the aspect of personality allied with the instincts. So, in another sense, Freud's word in German for the id was es, meaning it, a term suggested to him by the psychoanalyst George Grodek, who had sent Freud the manuscript of his book called The Book of It. The id contains our basic psychic energy, or libido, and is expressed through the reduction of tension. Increases in libidinal energy result in increased tension, and we then act in an attempt to reduce this tension to a more tolerable level. However, we must interact with the real world to satisfy our needs in order to maintain a comfortable level of tension. For example, people who are hungry must act to find food if they expect to discharge the tension induced by hunger. Therefore, some functional link between the id's demands and the reality must be established, and that is provided by the ego. The ego serves as the mediator between the id and the realities of the external world to facilitate their interaction. The ego represents reason or rationality, in contrast to the unthinking, insistent passions of the id. Freud called the ego ich, or ich, actually, which translates into the English as I, ich in German. So he did not like the word ego, and he rarely used it. So ego, or ich, or I, is the rational aspect of personality responsible for controlling the instincts, whereas the id, or the it, craves blindly and is totally unaware of reality. The ego, or the I, ich, is aware of reality, manipulates it, and regulates the id accordingly. The I, or ego, follows the reality principle, holding off the id or its pleasure-seeking demands until an appropriate object can be found to satisfy the need and reduce the tension. The ego does not exist independently of the id. In other words, the I does not exist independently of the it. The ego derives its power or energy from the id. The ego exists to help the id and is constantly striving to bring about satisfaction of the id's instincts. And so the I exists to help the it and is constantly striving to bring about satisfaction of the its instincts. Freud compared the interaction of I and it to a rider on a horse. The horse supplies the energy to move the rider along the trail, but the horse's power must be guided or reined in, or else the horse may balk and throw off the rider. Similarly, the it must be guided and checked, or it will overthrow the rational ego, or I. Then there is the superego. Again, the ego is the rational aspect of personality responsible for controlling the instincts. The superego, however, is the third part of Freud's structure of personality. The superego develops early in the life when the child assimilates the rules of conduct as taught by parents through a system of rewards and punishments. Behaviors that are wrong and being punished become part of the child's conscious, one part of the superego. Behaviors that are acceptable to the parents and that bring rewards become part of the ego ideal, the other part of the superego. The superego is the moral aspect of personality derived from internalizing parental and societal values and standards. Thus, childhood behavior is initially controlled by parental actions, but once the superego has formed behavior, it is determined by self-control. At that point, the person administers his or her own rewards and punishments. Freud's term for the superego was a word he coined, Überich, which means literally above I. Über in German meaning above or super, and ich meaning I. So Überich, Überich, Überich. So we have the it, the I and the above I. Or if you want to think of it in German, you can think of it as es, ich, und übrig. The superego represents morality. Freud described it as the advocate of a striving toward perfection. It is, in short, as much as we have been able to grasp psychologically of what is described as the higher side of human life. You can see that obviously the superego will be in conflict with the id. Unlike the ego, which attempts to postpone id satisfaction to more appropriate times and places, the superego will attempt to inhibit id satisfaction completely. Freud envisioned a continuous struggle within the personality as the ego is pressured by insistent and opposing forces. The ego must try to delay the id's sexual and aggressive urges, perceive and manipulate reality to relieve the resulting tension, and cope with the superego's demands for perfection. The ego is thus pressured on three sides, threatened by persistent dangers from the id, reality, and superego. When the ego becomes too severely stressed, the inevitable result is the development of anxiety. Anxiety functions as a warning that the ego is being threatened. Freud described three types. And so anxiety functions as a warning that the I is being threatened. Freud described three types. Objective anxiety arises from fear of actual dangers in the real world, such as spiders or snakes, or exams. Now, neurotic anxiety and moral anxiety derive from objective anxiety. Neurotic anxiety comes from recognizing the potential dangers inherent in gratifying the id instincts. It is not clear of the instincts themselves, but fear of the punishment likely to follow any indiscriminate it-dominating behavior. In other words, neurotic anxiety is a fear of being punished for expressing impulsive desires. Moral anxiety arises from a fear of one's own conscience. When we perform or even think of performing some act that is contrary to our conscience's moral values, we are likely to experience guilt or shame. Our resulting level of moral anxiety depends on how well developed our conscience is. Less virtuous people experience less moral anxiety. Anxiety induces tension, which motivates the individual to take some action to reduce it. According to Freud's theory, the ego, or the I, develops protective defenses, the defense mechanisms, which are unconscious denials or distortions of reality. And some of these defense mechanisms are described as follows. Again, the defense mechanisms are behaviors that represent unconscious denials or distortions of reality, but which are adopted to protect the I, or the ego, against anxiety. First, we have denial. Denial and denying is the existence of an external threat or traumatic event. For example, a person living with a terminal illness may deny the imminence of death. Displacement. The shifting it impulses from a threatening or unavailable object to an object that is available, such as replacing hostility toward one's boss with hostility towards one's child. That is displacement. Projection is attributing a disturbing impulse to someone else, such as saying you do not really hate your professor, but that he or she hates you. You're projecting. Rationalization, reinterpreting behavior to make it more acceptable and less threatening, such as saying the job from which you were fired was not really a good job anyway. That is rationalization. It is a reinterpreting behavior. Reaction formation is expressing an it or id impulse that is the opposite of the one that is driving the person. For example, someone disturbed by sexual longings may become a crusader against pornography. That is a reaction, a expressing. Regression is a retreating, actually, to an earlier, less frustrating period of life and displaying the childish and dependent behaviors characteristic of that more secure time. So you're regressing back to an earlier stage of time that was more secure. Repression is denying the existence of something that causes anxiety. You are repressing something. You're denying something, such as involuntary removing from consciousness some memory or perception that brings you discomfort. And then there's sublimation. Sublimation is really an altering or displacing an id or it impulse by diverting instinctual energy into socially acceptable behaviors, such as diverting sexual energy into artistically creative behaviors. So we have the psychosexual stages of personality development. Freud was convinced that his patients' neurotic disturbances originated in their childhood experiences. Thus, he became one of the first theorists to emphasize the importance of child development. He believed that the adult personality was formed almost completely by the age of 5. And according to his psychoanalytic theory of development, children pass through a series of psychosexual stages. Again, during this time, children are considered to be autoerotic. That is, they derive sensual pleasure from stimulating the body's erogenous zones or being stimulated by parents in normal caregiving activities. Each developmental stage centers on a specific erogenous zone. Psychosexual stages in psychoanalytic theory are the developmental stages of childhood centering on erogenous zones. The oral stage lasts from birth into the second year of life. During this stage, stimulation of the mouth, such as sucking, biting, and swallowing, is the primary source of sensual satisfaction. Inadequate satisfaction, too little or too much, of sucking, biting, and swallowing may produce an oral personality type, a person preoccupied with mouth habits, such as smoking, kissing, and eating. Freud believed that a wide range of adult behaviors, from excessive optimism to sarcasm and cynicism, could be attributed to events of the oral stage of development. In the anal stage, gratification shifts from the mouth to the anus, and children derive pleasure from the anal area of the body. This stage coincides with toilet training. Children may expel or withhold feces. Either situation shows a defiance of parental wishes. Conflict during this period can produce an anal expulsive adult who is dirty, wasteful, and extravagant, or an anal retentive adult who is excessively neat, clean, conscientious, compulsive, and concerned with being orderly, efficient, and thorough. During the phallic stage, which occurs around age 4, erotic satisfaction involves sexual fantasies and fondling and exhibiting of the genitals. The Oedipus complex occurs during this stage. Freud named the complex after the Greek legend in which Oedipus unknowingly kills his father and marries his mother. Freud suggested that children become sexually attracted to the parent of the opposite sex and fearful of the parent of the same sex, who is perceived as a rival. At this point, his childhood experiences supported this idea. Freud wrote, "I have found love of the mother and jealousy of the father in my own case, too." The Oedipus complex is at age 4 to 5, the unconscious desire of a boy for his mother and the desire to replace or destroy his father. Usually, children overcome the Oedipus complex by identifying with the parent of the same sex. In addition, they replace their sexual longing for the parent of the opposite sex with a more socially acceptable kind of affection. However, the attitudes toward the opposite sex that develop during this stage will persist, influencing adult relationships with members of the opposite sex. One outcome of identifying with the parent of the same sex is in terms of the superego's development, or the above I's development, Uber-Ich. Uber-Ich. I keep saying itch, but it's Uber-Ich. By adopting the mannerisms and attitudes of the same-sex parent, children assume the parent's superego, or Uber-Ich standards, or above I standards. Children who outlast the struggles of these early stages enter a period of latency from about age 5 to 12, when the onset of puberty signals the beginning of the genital stage. At that time, heterosexual behavior becomes important, and the person begins to prepare for marriage and parenthood. Of course, this leaves out the fact that there are a lot of people at the age of 12 and beyond that actually develop homosexual tendencies. We have mechanism and determinism in Freud's system. So the structural psychologist and later the behaviorist consider humans to be like machines. First, the human mind and then human behavior were reduced to their most elemental components. It may come to a surprise, actually, to learn that Freud, who approached human nature from such a different perspective, was also influenced by mechanistic ideas. Freud believed that all mental events, even dreams, are predetermined, and that nothing occurs by chance or free will. I agree in every respect. Every action has a conscious or unconscious motive or cause. Further, Freud accepted the doctrine that all phenomena could be reduced to the principles of the natural sciences. Indeed, by adopting the word analysis as part of his system of psychoanalysis, Freud was acknowledging the analytical methods often used in physics and chemistry. So we are giving to an analysis of the mind, of the psyche. In 1895, Freud decided to develop his concept of a scientific psychology, attempting to show that psychology must be rooted in the principles of physics and that mental phenomena exhibit many of the characteristics of the neuropsychological processes on which they are based. Psychology's aim would be to represent mental processes as quantitatively determined states of specific material particles. He never completed the project, however, but we see in his later writings the ideas and terminology he adopted from physics, especially mechanics, electricity, and hydraulics. These writings provide another instance of data lost to history because they were not uncovered for more than 50 years. Until then, no one knew Freud had considered such an approach to psychology. Although Freud modified his intention to model psychology after physics, when he found that his chosen subject matter, the human personality, could not be treated by physical and chemical techniques, he remained true to the positivism and determinism that nurtured experimental psychology. However, although Freud was influenced by this view, he was not constrained by it, however. He altered or discarded the philosophy where he saw it would not fit. In the end, he demonstrated how restricting a mechanistic conception of human nature could be. Psychoanalysis versus other academic psychology. Psychoanalysis developed outside of mainstream academic psychology and remained so for many years. Academic psychology largely closed its doors to psychoanalytic doctrine. An unsigned editorial in a 1924 issue of the Journal of Abnormal Psychology bemoaned the endless stream of writings on the unconscious by European psychologists. The editorial dismissed those writings as essentially worthless. Following that strong statement, few articles on psychoanalysis were accepted for professional publication for at least the next 20 years. Many academic psychologists offered forceful criticisms of psychoanalysis. In the year 1916, when virtually everything German was considered suspect because of Germany's wartime aggression, Christine Ladd Franklin wrote that psychoanalysis was a product of the undeveloped German mind. Robert Woodworth of Columbia University, that we have mentioned earlier, called psychoanalysis an uncanny religion that led rational people to draw absurd conclusions. John B. Watson called it voodooism. James McKean Cattell described Freud as a man who, quote, lives in the fairyland of dreams among the ogres of perverted sex, end quote. Despite these and other scathing attacks by the leaders of American psychology, some of Freud's ideas made their way into American psychology nonetheless. And they made their way into textbooks, and by the 1920s, defense mechanisms were being discussed seriously, along with the concept of the unconscious mind and the manifest and latent contents of dreams. Still, behaviorism remained the dominant school of thought in psychology, and psychoanalysis was generally ignored at the time. But by the 1930s and 1940s, psychoanalysis had captured public attention. The combination of sex, violence, and hidden motives, and the promise to cure a variety of emotional problems proved irresistible. The academic psychology establishment, however, was furious, arguing that people were confusing psychoanalysis and psychology, assuming that the two fields were the same. Psychologists hated the thought that sex, dreams, and neuroses were all that psychology was about. It had become clear to psychologists by the 1930s that psychoanalysis was not a passing craze, but a serious competitor, which threatened the foundations of scientific psychology, at least in the minds of the public. To deal with this threat, psychologists resolved to apply the experimental method to test psychoanalysis in order to determine its scientific legitimacy. Hundreds of studies later, psychologists declared that psychoanalysis was inferior to a psychology based on experimentation, at least in the eyes of the experimental psychologists. Although the design of many of these studies was questionable, psychologists believed that the results restored their position of primacy. In addition, their research showed that academic psychology could be relevant to the public interest because it was studying the same things as the psychoanalysts. The 1950s and the 1960s found behaviorists translating psychoanalytic terminology into the language of behavior. John Watson set the pace earlier when he defined emotions as merely sets of habits and described neurotic behavior as the result of faulty conditioning. B.F. Skinner recasted the Freudian defense mechanisms in the language of operant conditioning. Eventually, psychology incorporated many Freudian concepts and made them part of the mainstream. The role of the unconscious, the importance of childhood experiences, and the operation of the defense mechanisms are a few examples of psychoanalytic ideas that are firmly part of contemporary psychology today. the scientific validation of psychoanalytic concepts. As we noted, in the 1930s and the 1940s, many Freudian concepts were submitted to experimental tests with questionable results. In later years, researchers of greater validity were performing research and analysis of 2,500 studies from psychiatry, psychology, anthropology, and other disciplines examined the scientific credibility of Freud's formulations. Although some concepts resisted attempts at scientific validation, such as the id, ego, superego, death wish, libido, and anxiety, others were found to be amenable to scientific testing. The analysis showed that published studies provide some support for the following. 1. Some characteristics of the oral and anal personality types. 2. Castration anxiety. 3. The notion that dreams reflect emotional concerns. And 4. Aspects of the Oedipus complex in boys, which is the rivalry with the father and sexual fantasies about the mother. Freudian concepts that were tested but not supported by the experimental results include the following. First is dreams satisfy symbolically repressed wishes and desires. 2. In resolving the Oedipus complex, boys identify with the father and accept his superego standards out of fear. Third is that women have an inferior conception of their bodies, have less severe superego or above I standards than men, and find it more difficult to achieve an identity. And 4 is that personality is formed by age 5 and changes a little bit after that. So here we see 4 things from published scientific testing that provides some support for the following, and then we have others concepts that were not supported by scientific studies. More recent research shows strong support for the influence of unconscious processes on thoughts, emotions, and behavior, suggesting that unconscious influences may be more pervasive than Freud actually claimed. As one researcher noted, quote, "Today there is agreement that much psychological functioning occurs in opposition to what is consciously desired," end quote. We see later on that cognitive psychology has readmitted the study of unconscious mental processes. Research also supports the defense mechanisms of repression, denial, identification, projection, and displacement. Experiments on the so-called Freudian slip have shown that at least some of these verbal misstatements appear to be just what Freud said they were: unconscious conflicts and anxieties revealing themselves in embarrassing ways. A great deal of research continues to be conducted on dreams since Freud introduced the topic into psychology, showing that many of our everyday life experiences influence what we dream about. To mention only a few, it has been shown that playing video games, being exposed to extreme dangers such as in combat, and even the position in which we sleep can affect our dreams. Computer programs are being developed to track dream images while we sleep. The important point, however, about these scientific attempts to analyze Freudian principles is that at least some psychoanalytic concepts can be reduced to propositions that can be tested by the methods of science, even if all the concepts of Freud cannot be tested or shown to be true by science. We have criticisms of psychoanalysis. First is data collection. Freud's methods of collecting data have been the target of considerable criticism on a number of points. First, the conditions under which Freud collected data were unsystematic and they were uncontrolled. He did not make a verbatim transcript of each patient's words, but instead worked from notes he made several hours after seeing the patient. He said that, "I write them down for memory in the evening after work is done." Some original data, the patient's words, were surely lost in the time that elapsed because of the vagaries of memory and the possibility of distortions and omissions. Thus, the data consists only of what Freud remembered of what his patients said, not what his patients actually said. Second, while recalling his patients' words, critics argue that Freud may have reinterpreted them, guided by a desire to find material that supported his views. He might have recalled and recorded only what he wanted to hear. Of course, it is also possible that Freud's notes were accurate, but the important point here is that we cannot be certain because the original data has not survived. Third is that Freud may have inferred rather than actually heard the stories of sexual seduction in childhood based on his evaluation of the patient's symptoms. One writer suggests that although Freud claimed that almost all his female patients said they had been seduced by their fathers, Examination of the actual cases referred to by Freud reveals not a single instance in which this was the case. There is no evidence that any patient ever told Freud that she had been seduced by her father. This is nothing more than an inference on Freud's part. Critics also contend that Freud may have used suggestion or even more coercive procedures to elicit or implant such memories when no actual seduction had occurred. Freud himself acknowledged that recollections of seduction may have been fantasies which my patients had made up or which I myself had perhaps forced on them. Fourth, however, is Freud's research was based entirely on a small and unrepresentative sample of people, limited to himself and those who chose to undergo psychoanalysis with him. No more than a dozen or so cases have been detailed in Freud's writings, and most of those patients were young, unmarried, educated, upper-class women. It is difficult to generalize from this limited sample to the general population. Fifth, there are discrepancies between Freud's notes on his therapy sessions and the published case histories supposedly based on those notes. Researchers have found differences involving the length of the analysis and the sequence of events disclosed during analysis, as well as the unsubstantiated claims of cures. There is no way to determine whether Freud made these statements deliberately to provide support for his position, or whether they resulted from forces in his own unconscious. Historians are not able to trace errors in Freud's unpublished case studies because he destroyed most of them. He destroyed most of the patient files. Also, Freud published only 6 case histories after his break with Breyer, and none of them provide compelling supportive evidence for psychoanalysis. A biographer concluded, "Some of the cases present such dubious evidence in favor of psychoanalytic theory that one may seriously wonder why Freud even bothered to publish them. 2 of the cases were incomplete and the therapy ineffective. A 3rd case was not actually treated by Freud." Sixth, even if an accurate word-for-word record of the therapy sessions had been kept, it would not always have been possible to confirm the accuracy of the patient's reports. Freud made limited attempts to verify his patients' accounts of their childhood experiences. Critics argue that he should have questioned relatives and friends about the events described. In summary, then, critics describe the first step in scientific theory building, that of data collection, as incomplete, imperfect, and inaccurate in regard to Sigmund Freud. As for the next step, drawing inferences and generalizations from the data, we cannot assess how this was done because Freud never explained his reasoning. Because his data could not be quantified or analyzed statistically, historians cannot determine their reliability or even their statistical significance. Scholars have also challenged Freud's assumptions about women. He suggested that women have poorly developed superegos and inferiority feelings about their bodies because they lack a penis. The analyst Karen Horney, which we will discuss later on, left Freud's psychoanalytic circle because of this issue and developed her own system, arguing that women do not have penis envy. She suggested instead that men have womb envy. Most analysts today believe Freud's ideas about female psychosexual development are unproven and are in fact incorrect. In a later reading, we will note the work of other theorists who disagreed with Freud's emphasis on biological forces, particularly sex, as determinants of personality. These theorists considered the impact of social forces on personality development. Other neo-Freudians or new Freudians have challenged Freud's denial of free will and his focus on past behavior while excluding the effects of future hopes and goals as motivating forces. Some criticized Freud for developing a personality theory based only on neuronics and ignoring the traits of emotionally healthy people. All these points were used to build competing views of the human personality. The rise of these alternative theories soon led to divisiveness within the psychoanalytic family and to the formalization of derivative analytic schools of thought. So why has psychoanalysis survived so long with all those strikes against it? Well, to some extent, all theories of behavior are open to criticism on the grounds of scientific acceptability. Psychologists in search of a theory must sometimes select it on the basis of criteria other than formal scientific precision. Those who choose to accept psychoanalysis do not do so in the absence of any supporting evidence. Psychoanalysis does offer evidence, although not the kind usually accepted by science. Acceptance of psychoanalysis is based instead on an intuitive appearance of plausibility. Freud, who had little confidence in traditional experimental methods, argued vehemently that his work was scientific and that he had amassed ample proof to support his conclusions, although he did not. He also believed that the only people who were qualified to judge the scientific merit of his ideas were psychoanalysts like himself. Freud wrote that his system was based on, quote, an incalculable number of observations and experiences, and only someone who has repeated those observations on himself and on others is in a position to arrive at a judgment of his own upon it, end quote. That is Freud in 1940. But regardless of the scientific credibility of Freud's work, there is no denying the tremendous impact that it had on American academic psychology. Interest in Freud's ideas remains extremely high, and however, the popularity of psychoanalysis as therapy has declined when measured by the number of clients and by the number of people training to become analysts, even though some research supports the contention that psychodynamic psychotherapy derived from Freudian ideas can be successful. Expensive long-term Freudian therapy has been superseded by briefer and less expensive psychotherapies, such as behavioral therapies and cognitive behavioral therapies. Some therapies and therapists have found virtual analysis conducted over the internet to be a useful approach. Those who use this technique can even simulate a virtual reality waiting room as well as the therapy session itself. This overall trend away from face-to-face therapy has been reinforced by the cost-cutting measures instituted by managed health care programs. It is far less expensive to prescribe a psychoactive drug in a single doctor's visit than a course of psychotherapy lasting several months. The number and variety of prescription antidepressant and antipsychotic medications have increased dramatically over the past 25 years. The development of various drug regimens has reduced the need for psychotherapies for certain types of mental disorders. The success of many drug therapies has led some psychiatrists and clinical psychologists to revise their thinking about the contributing factors to mental illness away from the psychic school of thought and back to the somatic. The somatic or biochemical approach holds that mental disorders result from chemical imbalances in the brain. Why prescribe expensive, time-consuming psychotherapies when the patient can pop a pill and feel better? Drug treatment, however, is not appropriate for all conditions or all patients. So it is interesting that Freud long ago predicted this development would occur in the treatment of mental disorders. Concerning Freud's influence, the American popular culture and psychoanalysis. Freud's influence on American popular culture and consciousness has been enormous and was evident immediately after his 1909 visit to Clark University. Newspapers featured many stories about Freud, and by 1920, more than 200 books had been published on psychoanalysis. Between 1909 and Freud's death in 1939, close to 1,000 articles on psychoanalysis appeared in the New York Times. Magazines such as Ladies' Home Journal, The Nation, and The New Republic ran frequent feature stories. A major movie studio, MGM, offered Freud $100,000 to collaborate on a film about love, but he refused. In October of 1924, Freud appeared on the cover of Time magazine, and his work on dreams had become so well known by that time that a popular song was written about it. One line was, "Don't tell me what you dreamed last night, for I've been reading Freud." And actually, Freud appeared on Time magazine 3 times, which is very unusual for a psychologist. In 2005, the British Broadcasting Company produced a 4-hour television documentary on Freud's influence in Western society. The Century of the Self showed how his theories affected marketing and advertising, political campaigning, and public relations, particularly as developed in the United States by his nephew Edward Bernays. As noted, this public enthusiasm for Freud's ideas occurred much earlier than his acceptance by academic psychology. The 20th century saw a loosening of sexual restraints in behavior, the arts, literature, and entertainment, a development often mistakenly attributed to the influence of Freud. It is ironic, however, that Freud's message about sex has been so misinterpreted. He never argued for weakening sexual codes of conduct or for increased sexual freedom. Rather, his view was that inhibiting the sex drive was necessary for the survival of civilization. Despite his intention, however, the degree of sexual liberation that marked much of the 20th century was partly a result of Freud's work because his emphasis on sex helped popularize his ideas. Even in scientific journals, articles about sex attract attention. We must conclude, however, then, that despite its lack of scientific rigor and its methodological weaknesses, Freudian psychoanalysis became a vital force in modern psychology. Freud remains the most frequently cited individual in the psychological research literature, according to published citation indexes. The division of psychoanalysis, which is Division 39, is the sixth largest of all the APA's divisions. When Time magazine put Freud on its cover in April of 1956 for the second time, the psychoanalytic movement in America had arrived, and for the next several decades, psychoanalysis largely dominated the mental health field. Now, well into the 21st century, Freud's influence even beyond psychology remains vital and strong. An editorial in the New York Times noted on the occasion of his death in 1939 that Freud was, quote, the most effective disturber of complacency in our time, end quote. In 1929, E.G. Boring, a historian on psychology, wrote in his textbook, A History of Experimental Psychology, that psychology had no truly great proponent of the stature of Darwin or Helmholtz. In his second edition, published 21 years later in 1950, Boring revised his opinion. Reflecting the developments in psychology during the intervening decades, he wrote of Freud with admiration, quote, now he is seen as the greatest originator of all, the agent of the zeitgeist who accomplished the invasion of psychology by the principle of the unconscious process. It is not likely that the history of psychology can be written in the next 3 centuries without mention of Freud's name and still claim to be a general history of psychology. And there you have the best criterion of greatness, posthumous fame, end quote. That was written in 1950. And he cleverly used the agent of the zeitgeist to accomplish the invasion of psychology. And obviously we know that Freud called free association invasion association.